Just after dawn on the 10th of July 2026, a lorry came through the tunnel beneath the English Channel carrying a single object. 70 meters of embroidered linen sewn more than 9 centuries ago, sealed in a climate-controlled case and escorted like a head of state. It was the first time the Bayeux Tapestry had left France since it was made. The British Museum sold out 4 months of tickets before the case was even opened. The last time this story crossed the Channel, it went the other way, and it did not come to be looked at. The tapestry tells the story of 1066, the year England was conquered. It was commissioned by the winning side, almost certainly for William's half-brother Odo, the Bishop of Bayeux. But most scholars believe the hands that actually stitched it were English. Fine embroidery was England's luxury craft, and the conquerors used the workshops they had just acquired. That detail hangs over everything that follows. The winners wrote this story with the losers' hands, and the story is bigger than any single scene in it. Within 12 months, England would see 3 kings, 2 invasions, and the end of an age 6 centuries old. But 1066 was not decided in one October day. It was decided in the 10 months before it. That is the story almost nobody tells, and it begins with an old king, a new church, and a promise nobody can prove. The story starts in the autumn of 1065, in an England that does not know it has 1 year left. The king is Edward, later called the Confessor. He is about 60, devout and childless. He is also half Norman, and that fact has a history. His mother was the daughter of a Norman duke, and when Danish invaders conquered England in his childhood, Edward escaped to her family and spent a quarter of a century in exile at the Norman court. He returned to his throne with Norman friends, Norman advisors, and Norman debts of gratitude. That upbringing is why a duke across the Channel would one day believe England had been promised to him. But in 1065, the urgent word is childless because English kingship was not a simple bloodline machine. A dying king could designate his heir, but the crown was confirmed by the Witan, the council of the kingdom's great men, and the Witan chose the candidate the realm could survive. For a generation, the realm's muscle had belonged to one family. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, was the richest man in England and its most experienced general. His younger brother Tostig held the wild northern earldom of Northumbria. Then, in October 1065, the North rose. The Northumbrians had had enough of Tostig, his taxes, and, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, his habit of killing inconvenient men. The rebels marched south and demanded his removal. Edward sent Harold to negotiate, and Harold, reading the country, sided with the rebels' demand against his own brother. Tostig was outlawed by November and sailed into exile in Flanders, convinced that Harold had engineered the whole thing. England entered its fatal year with its defense already cracked from the inside and its first enemy already made. He would not be its most dangerous one. 2 months later, on the 28th of December 1065, Edward's life's work was consecrated. Westminster Abbey, a vast new church in the Norman style, the largest building raised in England since the Romans left. The king was too ill to attend his own triumph. 8 days later, on the 5th of January, he died in the palace beside it. The Bayeux Tapestry shows the deathbed. A gaunt Edward reaches out and touches Harold's hand. And the tapestry's caption, which narrates everything else in this story so confidently, refuses to say what the gesture means. The English sources are not shy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says Edward entrusted the kingdom to Harold. The Life of King Edward, written for Edward's widow, who was Harold's sister, says the same. The next morning, the 6th of January, the 9-day-old abbey held a funeral and a coronation over the same fresh grave. Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England within about a day of Edward's last breath. To the English court, the speed was prudence. The kingdom faced threats from 2 directions, and it needed a grown fighting king immediately, not a debate. To the court across the Channel, it was the sprint of a usurper to a stolen throne. Both readings were available that January morning. Which one you heard depended on which side of the water you stood. 3 men now believed the crown of England belonged to them, and no 2 of their claims even rested on the same kind of ground. Harold had the deathbed designation, the Witan's confirmation, and the country's armies. What he lacked was royal blood. Edgar, called the Aetheling, had exactly the opposite. He was the grandson of a former king, the last male of the ancient royal house of Wessex. He was also about 14, with no faction, no lands to speak of, and no army, and the men who chose kings had just chosen not to risk a child. And across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, Edward's first cousin once removed, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne 15 years earlier, back in 1051. That promise, in some form, may well have been made. Edward spent that year quarreling with the Godwin family and leaning on his Norman friends. But the claim's building materials matter. A 15-year-old promise reported after the fact by Norman writers. And one thing more, an oath, the most consequential promise in English history. And where that story comes from is a story in itself. Around 1064, about 2 years before Edward died, Harold crossed the Channel. Why is unknown. Norman writers say Edward sent him to confirm William's succession. A later English tradition says he went to ransom captive relatives. The tapestry typically shows him feasting and sailing and lets you decide. Whatever the errand, it went wrong. Harold was shipwrecked, seized by a local count, and ransomed out of captivity by Duke William himself. He then spent a season as William's honored guest, which is a polite phrase for a man who cannot leave. He rode with William's army into Brittany. At Mont Saint-Michel, the tapestry shows Harold personally hauling 2 Norman soldiers out of quicksand. A small act of heroism the Norman artists were happy to record because it makes what comes next binding between honorable men. Then, the scene this episode is named for. Harold stands between 2 reliquaries, 1 hand on each, and swears an oath to William. The stitching says only, "Here Harold made a sacred oath to Duke William." It does not say what he swore, but before an oath can bind a kingdom, it has to survive one question. Who tells this story? Oh, William of Poitiers, the Duke's own chaplain, writing after the conquest, says Harold swore to secure the throne for William. Other Norman writers repeat it. No English source mentions any oath at all. And the Norman accounts cannot even agree on where it happened. Poitiers says Bonneville. Orderic Vitalis says Rouen. The tapestry places it at Bayeux, which happens to be the seat of the bishop who commissioned it. Around 1100, an English monk named Edmer finally wrote down the other version. If Harold swore anything, he swore it as a captive, and an oath extracted under duress bound no one. The oath mattered because it converted an invasion into an enforcement action. It let William present himself to Europe, and by one account to the Pope himself, as a man reclaiming what was sworn to him. That papal blessing, a consecrated banner sent from Rome, rests on the word of the same ducal chaplain. No papal record of it survives. History's most consequential promise is, on the surviving evidence, the winner's paperwork. Since, in the last week of April 1066, 4 months into Harold's reign, a light appeared in the evening sky and grew until it trailed fire. We know it as Halley's Comet. England watched it burn for a week. At Malmesbury Abbey, an old monk named Aylmer looked up and, according to the chronicler William of Malmesbury, writing decades later, spoke to it directly. "You have come, have you? You source of tears to many mothers." Aylmer had seen the same comet as a boy, 77 years earlier. His 2 sightings bracket the entire final act of Anglo-Saxon England. And here the tapestry does something worth catching in the act. It stitches the comet directly over Harold's palace with a crowd pointing and the caption, "These men marvel at the star." In the border beneath Harold's throne, it adds a row of ghostly empty ships. The omen and the invasion fleet sewn into the same panel. But the tapestry was made years after the battle by people who knew exactly how the story ended. In April 1066, the comet was simply a terrifying light in the sky. its meaning was embroidered in afterward. Prophecy is easy to stitch in hindsight. William deserves the same fair hearing. He had been Duke of Normandy since the age of about 8, a bastard son in a duchy where that word was said to his face. He survived a childhood in which his guardians were murdered around him, one of them, by later report, killed in the room where the boy slept. The man that childhood produced was, by 1066, the most feared soldier in northern France. And in January, when word of Harold's coronation crossed the water, William committed himself to something no Duke of Normandy had ever attempted. His objective, stated plainly, demanded everything Normandy did not have to spare. Normandy alone could not conquer England, so he needed a coalition: Bretons, Flemings, French adventurers, fighting men from across the continent, recruited with promises of English land they did not yet own. He needed a fleet that did not exist, hundreds of ships built from standing timber in a matter of months. The tapestry shows the axes going into the trees. He needed the church, and by his chaplain's account he got it, a papal banner blessing the enterprise, with the oath as the legal engine of the whole case. And he needed to move horses, thousands of them, across open water, something Northern Europe had little practice in at this scale. Every part of that project was expensive, slow, and reversible, except one. Once the fleet sailed, there was no version of this that ended with William rowing home a duke. His nobles reportedly told him it could not be done. He assembled it anyway, and by August it stood ready at the mouth of the Dives, waiting on the one thing money and will could not buy: a south wind. England knew it was coming, and in May, ships did appear off the south coast, but they were not Norman. Tostig, the exiled brother, had returned, raiding the Isle of Wight and Sandwich, pressing sailors into his crews. Chased off by the fleet, he raided his way up the east coast until the young Earls Edwin and Morcar broke his force in Lindsey. He limped to Scotland with 12 small ships, out of the war for now. But his raid had done its work on English strategy. Harold now mobilized everything. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says he gathered a greater army and fleet than any king in this land had gathered before. The fleet based at the Isle of Wight. The levies of the shires strung out along the whole southern coast, watching every beach from Cornwall to Kent. It was, by the standard of the age, a magnificent defensive machine. And here is the fact on which this entire year turns. That machine ran on food. And food, in a kingdom that fed its armies from obligation and local supply, was a calendar. The machine Harold was running is worth a close look because its design decided the year. England's army had two parts. At its core stood the housecarls, professional household troops, an institution the Danish kings had brought to England, armed with the two-handed battle axe that could take down a horse and rider in one stroke. Around them stood the Fyrd, the shire levies. This was not a peasant mob with pitchforks. The obligation, reconstructed by historians from Domesday Book records, ran roughly one well-armed man from every 5 hides of land, a select force of thousands, raised county by county. But the Fyrd was built for the wars England actually had, short campaigns close to home. The men who served were the men whose fields fed the kingdom, and the custom of service, as best the records let us see it, provisioned a campaign in terms of weeks, not season. Harold kept that force standing on the beaches through June, through July, through August. Month after month of watching an empty sea while the harvest at home came due. It may be the longest sustained defensive watch any Anglo-Saxon king ever asked of his kingdom, and the fact that it held that long is itself remarkable. The characteristic weapon of the summer of 1066 was not the housecarl's axe, and it was not the Norman lance. It was the provision cart, and on the 8th of September, the carts were empty. Because here is what makes the summer of 1066 a campaign, even though no two armies ever saw each other. On the far shore, William had the same problem in a crueler shape. His fleet stood ready at the Dives from the middle of August. The wind blew from the north and west for a month, And every day it blew wrong. Thousands of soldiers and horses ate through Normandy's supplies in a coalition army held together by promises. His chaplain, William of Poitiers, boasts that the Duke forbade his men to plunder the local countryside, and even allowing for a chaplain's flattery, holding an idle mercenary army in camp for a month without letting it feed on the neighbors is its own kind of generalship. Then, around the 12th of September, the weather broke the wrong way. A westerly storm scattered the fleet up the Channel coast, and William regrouped what was left at Saint-Valery at the mouth of the Somme. Poitiers admits that men drowned, and that the Duke had them buried quietly to keep the army from thinking about it. At Saint-Valery, William did the last thing left to a commander out of moves. He had the relics of the local saint carried out of the church and paraded through the camp, and the whole army prayed for the wind to change. 2 armed coasts, one strait of bad weather between them, and both commanders staring at the sky. The Channel was deciding the war before a single arrow flew. On the 8th of September, the feast of the Nativity of St. Mary, Harold's summer ran out. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states it without drama. The men's provisions were gone, and no man could hold them there any longer. The levies were released to their shires and their harvest. The king rode for London. The fleet was sent around to the Thames, and the Chronicle adds one more quiet disaster. Many ships were lost on the way. After 4 months of perfect vigilance, the south coast of England stood open. Now, a note of honesty, because this is a live argument among historians as this episode is made. In March of 2026, Professor Tom Licence argued that the famous stand down rests on a misreading 2 centuries old, that the ships coming home meant a working fleet returning to base, not a navy dissolving. Mark Morris and others have pushed back hard, and the sources, which thin out exactly here, do not settle it. This series will not pretend the question is closed, but on the fact that matters, the accounts agree. After the 8th of September, the beaches of Sussex had no army standing behind them. The finest defensive effort in English memory had ended the only way a supply calendar can end. Quietly, on schedule, and at the worst possible moment. What remains is the reckoning, and for once it is a reckoning without a battle. Harold's objective, in his own terms, as far as the record shows them, was this: hold the crown the Witan gave him by holding the coast until winter closed the Channel and bought England a year to prepare. Measured against that objective, his summer was very nearly enough. He held that coast for 4 months with the largest defensive force his kingdom had ever fielded, through a summer in which his enemy never managed to sail, and he came within roughly 3 weeks of the autumn weather that would have ended the threat for the year. As pure execution, the watch on the coast was a success in every week except the last one. And yet the gap between that performance and what followed is the whole meaning of this episode. The system that raised his army was built on obligations measured in weeks, and no king could feed what the land could not spare. There is one object that catches this year better than any chronicle: Harold's silver penny. Every coin he struck at dozens of mints across England carries the same single word on the back: Pax, peace. A king who would reign 9 months, who spent his summer staring at a hostile sea, and his autumn at war, minting peace onto every silver penny in the kingdom. 9 centuries later, it is impossible to tell whether that word was a promise, a prayer, or the first draft of a story about a reign that never got the chance to happen. On the coins, at least, the English got to write their own version. On the 27th of September, the wind at Saint-Valery finally swung to the south, and William's army began boarding before nightfall. But that is not the fleet that ends this episode. Because while the Duke watched his weathercock and while England's coast stood empty, more than 300 ships were already moving down the coast of Scotland. They were not Norman. At their head sailed the most famous warrior in the northern world, a man who had fought from Norway to Constantinople, and beside him, an English earl with a score to settle. Tostig was coming home, and he was bringing the last great army of the Viking age with him. That story is part 2.